All right, I think we are good to get started. Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Michelle McGuire. I'm the Director of Product Strategy at Kin + Carta. Supply chains have seen major disruptions in the wake of COVID. So it can feel like we're failing, but really we're not. Things may look a little different and feel difficult, but we've still gotten so many people the basic things they need. For me, this brings to mind the story of Apollo 13, what NASA called their most successful failure in history. After an explosion on board, the crew was in a dire situation. There was no time for planning, only action. This was not a time to waver, but a time for bold, swift decisions. So while Apollo 13 never made it to the moon, in a seemingly impossible situation, 3 crew members were brought safely home. And beyond that, the best thing that NASA did from the situation was learn. What if the challenges we're facing with COVID-19 could be our most successful failure? Theory is great, but let's put this into practice. Today, we're going to get highly practical, actionable things that every organization can start with right after this call. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to look at 5 key areas and dig deep into one as an example. And we'll have some time at the end to answer questions. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to leave them in the Q&A section of the Zoom app. So let's get to it. With me, I have Dan Stolarski, Senior Managing Director.
Good afternoon, everybody.
And Mark Ardito, VP of Cloud Modernization.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining.
At Kin + Carta, we have a unique philosophy of bringing together suits and t-shirts. That means that we approach client solutions by combining strategy and technology. Dan represents our suits, and Mark represents our t-shirts. So Dan, let's start with you. You've spent a lot of time working with clients and implementing supply chain planning capabilities. What activities do you see being most relevant in today's environment and beyond COVID? Dan, I'll hand it to you.
Thanks, Michelle. So for quarantine, I did drop the suit, but still managed to dress up. So look, first of all, let's just start with what we're not going to cover here, and that is to state the obvious of how demand has surged or dropped to unprecedented levels, depending on what industry segment or product category you're in. Or that we have a silver bullet for how we should have recognized and been able to respond to these drastic changes to demand. If you're brands like Breville or Cuisinart, for example, back in January, would you have anticipated a 700% increase in demand of bread makers in March? Probably not. In fact, I doubt anyone has planned for a global pandemic that would shut down the world economy as part of their supply chain planning scenarios. However, if you did, please raise your hand, as that would be an impressive demonstration of some great scenario planning. What we would like to focus on instead is, now that we're here, really what can organizations do to improve on their supply chain planning capabilities now and in the post-COVID environment that we will surely look different than pre-COVID. At Kin + Carta, we do believe that there will be a new permanent normal when we come out of the pandemic. In fact, interestingly enough, behavioral psychologists note that it takes about 90 days for behavior to change permanently. No doubt that will be beyond 90 days of some form of lockdown or social distancing measures. And so a sharp focus on supply chain planning is going to be absolute paramount. So one critical process that has stood the test of time in is sales and operations planning, or S&OP. S&OP has always been a critical activity for both B2B and B2C organizations, and it's ever more relevant in today's environment. Yet, interestingly enough, so many organizations either do not deploy it or really just haven't really figured out how to optimize it. So now's the time to really put some serious thought into assessing if your organization has a mature S&OP process in place. Perhaps what gaps exist in the process, or if you do not have one, how to get started. And just to be clear, having designed and implemented many S&OP processes in my career, it certainly is not a trivial task. And we'll get to some of that in a bit. But for organizations that are able to fully stand up a robust S&OP process, the differences are very real. With improvements to many KPIs, such as better product introduction execution, increased forecast accuracy, higher product margins, better inventory productivity, fewer excess write-offs, and ultimately better on time and in full order fulfillment to your customers.
So Dan, in case anyone on the webinar isn't aware of what an S&OP process is, can you break that down for us?
Yeah, sure, Michelle. So the overarching objective of the S&OP process is really to manage and allocate your critical resources to meet the needs of the customers in the most efficient manner. It is the process by which we bring together all the parts of the business. And that really ranges from sales and marketing to product development, operations, sourcing, and finance. It is a highly structured and disciplined decision-making process, and it does require executive team involvement. S&OP is really a subset of the overall business planning. And so while strategic and long-range capital planning have a horizon of 1 to 5 years, it's important to note that S&OP has a planning horizon of the next 2 to 18 months. And so it aligns the company resources into a single set of supply and sales plans. The S&OP process includes really, at a minimum, 4 key activities that are certainly going to be nuanced in terms of how they are designed and implemented company to company. But at a high level, the 4 core activities are data collection, demand and supply planning, pre-S&OP review, and an executive S&OP review. The data collection process is by far the most critical input into the process. And really, traditionally, this has been a very, very manual and difficult process. And so, Mark, I think you may have some perspectives on the data collection component of this.
Yeah, data collection, it's a really large and complex process. So first, you just need to collect all of the raw data. That in itself, it's not very challenging, and most people tend to collect lots of data. And that's a good thing. You can never have too much data. But after you collect this data, you need to ingest it somehow into some data platform. This is where a lot of complexity comes in. So data comes to us in all shapes and sizes, and the rate of data is unique as well. So we can get data that's real time. We can get it hourly, weekly, monthly, batch, cycle, things like this. Also, data can be structured or unstructured. So it can be very neat and tidy in rows and columns is structured, or it could be time series, like something that's very unstructured, or just loose free-flowing data. So also data fields, they're called different things by different people. So think about what a manufacturer might call a data field compared to what a distributor might call a data field. So we have these complexities of when you want to ingest it, you have to right size some of this data and mesh it up together. With this, data collections can grow very quickly as well. An example, a previous company that I came from, we processed 17 billion transactions a day, and we sent those transactions through the supply chain. So imagine 17 billion day over day over day. Obviously, this gets really big. And now you can start to see how this is growing in complexity and difficulty.
Thanks, Mark. And so as the process moves through its monthly cycle, the organization ultimately decides the best path forward, aligning unconstrained demand with constrained supply. And that is supported by a lot in part by the data collection that Mark just touched on. And ultimately, with the help of predefined business rules and exception-based management, the organization can make highly informed decisions on how to best deploy its resources to meet customer needs and what the financial implications are associated with those decisions. So that effectively, in a nutshell, is the S&OP process.
Thank you both for breaking that down. So as a follow-up, Dan, what's an example of a well-executed S&OP process versus one that isn't as mature?
Yeah, it's a great question, Michelle. So really one of the ways that I tend to view maturity is through the lens of listening in on the various S&OP meetings that occur throughout the monthly cycle. So you'll have, oftentimes you'll have organizations that are pretty successful in setting up the structure, getting some of the data inputs that Mark touched on, and even really getting that cross-functional and executive level participation. But really, we then look at the meeting agendas that happen through that monthly cycle, and we listen to what the conversations are like. And that is a pretty good signal for us in terms of how mature the organization is in its S&OP process. And so if you're spending more than 5 to 10 minutes on historical analysis or postmortem assessments, you're not really taking the S&OP process to its really to its fundamental objectives. The mature S&OP process is truly focused on the vast majority of the meetings, and the content and everything else associated with it focuses on the next 2 to 18 months and doesn't necessarily dwell too much on past performance. S&OP is not a postmortem process, and that's a key distinction.
Thanks, Dan. That definitely helps set some benchmarks for S&OP maturity. But I really want to dig into some of the obstacles to getting there. So Mark, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing in a company's ability to fully unlock the value of a robust supply chain planning process like S&OP?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I'm seeing is storage. So I talked earlier about how collection and ingestion, it's hard and it's complex. Now imagine the storage components to this dilemma. So the data adds up quickly. I was walking through all the different feeds that you could get and then how this starts to kind of multiply and snowball out of control. I mentioned at my previous job, we were processing 17 billion transactions a day, and our supply chain data was well north of many hundreds of terabytes of data. You can't easily just go to Best Buy and go buy 100 terabytes of storage and then plug that in somewhere. Like, this takes a lot of planning, and if you don't want to get flooded by the data, you've got to have a lot of good planning in place. And you know, I just think that the storage really starts to become an issue here as we grow through this. Yeah, and it just compounds on top of itself.
Mark, I'm going to date myself a little bit. I remember the day that I bought a 100 meg memory stick for $100 at Best Buy.
Nice.
Well, things have definitely changed. And Mark, that sounds like a lot of data. So is there any downside to having too much data?
No, you can never have too much data. Like I said before, you know, a few years ago, everybody was walking around saying that they were technology companies. I think everybody now is walking around saying they're data companies, and it's true. I don't care what line of work or what endeavor you're in, you are a data company. And I think this is where organizations can really start to lean on public clouds for this opportunity for supply chain. So like I said, if you want to manage this data and have a data center and buy hardware, and now you're in the hardware business and you're maintaining hardware, you can go and do that. It's really hard to do. This is what public clouds do really well. So they burst with storage capability, they burst with compute capability. You can buy things when you need them, and when you don't need them, you can give them back. So you're not stuck with holding on to data center assets and stuck with all this physical thing in your data. So all this data, it comes into another concern as well. So not only if you have hundreds of terabytes of data, but what if you want to run queries on these large sets of data? It takes a massive amount of compute power. And that's where clouds really come into play here. So you can burst up with compute. You can spin all that down when you don't need it. And so your queries that you need, so if you need to merge tables together for supply chain and get queries between manufacturers and vendors and distributors, this stuff is really easy to do in a cloud and get it done quickly. If you are stuck doing this through Excel or hardware inside your data center, some of these queries can take many hours to a day to run. And when you need answers now, you really need that ability to get it out there. So scaling up and down with compute power when necessary, that's really one of the big things to focus on as well.
Got it. So every company is now a data company, but why does that matter? What are organizations doing with all that data?
Yeah, so the key to making supply chain work is having a strong understanding of your data, not only just understanding it, but being able to visualize it. And I think when you can visualize your data well, it's when you truly unlock some of the potential of it. Everybody struggles with this. So please don't think that you're unique to the situation here if you're listening to this webinar. Everybody struggles with this. The one thing to work on as well is an open data governance policy. A lot of times people put in data governance policies and they're well intended, but a lot of times it's detrimental because people can't get access to the data when they need to. I want to show you an example of something that we did at Kin + Carta here. So we have lots of data examples or data sources here of interactions at Kinencarta. So we have Slack, we have Salesforce, we have all of our internal tools as well. And this is something that we built, and it just shows interactions across the globe of all of our kin, 1,600 kin as we're interacting with each other. We loaded all this data into a modern data tool and we output this. Honestly, the hardest part of this exercise that we put together was getting access to the data. Heck, we owned these tools. We owned Slack and Salesforce, and the hardest part of this thing was just getting access to the data. Once we got access to it, putting this together was sort of the smallest piece of the puzzle. So that's why I say that having this data governance, it is good, but sometimes it becomes detrimental because honestly, just getting access to the right data. These tools are really good at merging structured, unstructured data, complex things like that. But getting access to the data sometimes can be the hardest part.
Thanks, Mark. So Dan, looking across the business, what can companies do now?
Yeah, so I'll start from a business perspective and a process perspective. So really start with bringing together all the relevant planning functions into a single room. The most common pitfall in supply chain planning that we often see is that organizations tend to isolate this critical activity to the core supply chain planning functions, which often entails the demand planning, the sourcing, manufacturing, supply planning portions. But what about sales, marketing, finance? For example, sales and marketing have an important pulse on early demand signals. They need to be part of that demand planning portion of the process. Sales will, for example, have a very good view on any new customer accounts coming online, which obviously triggers a one-time demand and supply event that would, not really be picked up in any statistical forecast rerun. Also, new product information. It's also critical to have incorporated into the demand and supply meetings. As we all know, a successful product launch relies heavily on integrated planning. So really the product teams, sourcing, manufacturing, sales, account management, demand planning, they all need to be in sync on new product launch timing, which then really drives the allocation planning, inventory flows, the inventory positioning, and so forth. And so having all of these functions planning and working together may sound trivial, but it's amazing how many organizations just really take this product information, toss it over the wall, over to sales and marketing for them to digest without a proper forum to discuss all the details. So part of the S&OP process and part of the big benefit of the S&OP process is to have all these planning functions working together in a really disciplined way. And Mark, I suspect you have some thoughts on what companies can do now from a technology perspective.
Yeah, I think for now, so technology, it's advanced so much in the past 30 years, but yet when we look at supply chain, we still see a lot of organizations tracking and managing their data through spreadsheets for supply chain. And so I think that the advancement of some of these tools that are offered on clouds has come so far that the struggles you're going with right now on supply chain and managing that data, merging it together, ingesting it, these tools take care of that stuff. However, you've got to get to a public cloud in order to take advantage of those things. So I think if there were some things to take away right now, it's start looking at that cloud journey. How do you get there? Because look, if you can manage this data in spreadsheets, create pivot tables, build out visualizations, you are just one step away from getting to a cloud platform. So I think that the key is if you can do it today in spreadsheets, you could probably do it in a public cloud. It's not that far of a leap. And I think the visualizations will get you on the right track as well.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, Mark, around the visualization piece especially. So core to any S&OP process is the ability to report on a set of dashboards and metrics to help executives make key decisions. Traditionally, these bits of information and metrics have been cobbled together from numerous sources and really put into spreadsheets or PowerPoint charts. So why not take that piece of the process and create a digital twin of it by creating S&OP dashboards. So, you know, taking and really, you know, you don't have to start with taking all the data, but for the key data that you need for some of these metrics and KPIs, as Mark just said, take some of that, put it into a cloud, and now take these reports that you're normally building out through a manual process and digitize them, which can certainly be done through a fairly quick custom application build. And I would really consider that as one of quick wins for the S&OP process.
Thanks, Dan and Mark. So before we get to questions, I'd love to hear a few final thoughts from each of you. So what would you want to ensure that we take away from today? Mark, I'll hand it to you first.
Yeah, I think if you can take something away from today is you just need to start. So everyone has problems with their tech or their data around supply chain. You're never going to have that one unique opportunity where you can overhaul the whole thing. So I think if I could recommend, I would just start with one small thing that's causing you pain right now. I talked a lot about data collection and ingestion. Maybe that's something that you're struggling with today. Maybe tackle with some of the things that I talked about. Get some of those pain points, get the friction out, but you've got to start. So making progress is better than eternally planning.
Thanks for that insight, Mark. Dan, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, look, so the S&OP process does require structure and discipline. But I think if you're an organization that's potentially just starting down the journey of building out an S&OP process, recognize that it is a process where you iterate on and fine tune over time. You have to just believe the process. And one thing in particular is try to stick to that meeting cadence. So again, I said this earlier, one of the key things that comes out of this S&OP process, or really what the S&OP process enforces, is that it brings all those relevant planning functions together into a single room, and there's one voice of the company's entire demand and supply information. And just bringing those people together in a consistent and disciplined manner is really going to start to produce some benefits. So I'd say just really believe the process and just go into it understanding that you're not going to have it perfect in the first few monthly cycles. It does get better and better over time, but stick to the discipline.
Thank you both. All right, we'll go to questions now. The first one, Dan, I'm going to hand to you. The question is, what steps can a company make to improve their demand planning and forecasting processes?
Yeah, so the age-old question of how to improve forecasting and demand planning. You know, like there's a lot companies can do from a process perspective, but traditionally forecasting and demand planning activities have been very manual. Mark talked a lot about the power of bringing all that data into the cloud. But when you look at some of the ways that companies have improved, just really from a process perspective and how they've collaborated on data. Again, if you're a manufacturer, you have the information that you obviously have sold into and shipped. But even there's some common pitfalls, because if you're using that historic information and if you're using shipment data, you may not necessarily be accounting for any inventory shortages that you may have had at that time when you were making that shipment. So that's really not an accurate representation of what that true demand was. So you really need to be looking at your original order data that came from your customer when taking at least that into account. Companies have also then started to do years ago a much better job of really integrating downstream sell-through data from their customers. But again, very manual, often on Excel, often gets emailed over from somebody to an account rep, and that gets, again, cobbled together. I think interestingly, more recently, companies are using more and more macroeconomic information to inform key demand events. But as Mark mentioned earlier, really I see the power of demand planning and forecasting is really getting unlocked with modern technologies, which allow us to consolidate all of these disparate data sources and start to get that sort of layer of predictive analytics. And demand, by the way, is not just what you were predicting for in the future, but it's also having all of your inventory positioning in place as well, so that you have that more accurate picture. And so these advanced analytic algorithms even help adjust for seasonality or missed sales, and so forth. And so now you can even start to layer in your Google Trends search as a way to even further advance that predictive analytics component. So for example, you've set up Google Trends with keywords that match to your products. You may start to see some interesting search results at a particular region of the country. And that starts to then feed into that more advanced predictive analytics. But again, once you have it all sort of combined into a good data source.
Thanks for that, Dan. So our next question, I think I'll hand to Mark. So which organizations are doing this well right now from a data or cloud perspective?
Yeah, I think one company that has been pretty public talking about their journey with supply chain has been Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, the oil company. They're a refinery, they're an oil distribution company. They do everything from the whole supply chain of oil, from what they pull out of the ground all the way to what they deliver at the gas pump. So they have IoT data coming from oil rigs. They have more data coming out of refineries, more data coming from the distribution channel, more data coming from the gas stations that are selling the gasoline as well. This is really complex stuff to pull together, and they're doing it really well. They have a strong grasp on their supply chain. They use cloud native tools to get this stuff done. They're very public about their use of the cloud and how it is an advantage for their supply chain. It takes a ton of compute power to get that done and to visualize it, and they seem to be doing that really well. So that's one that I would say is kind of executing on all cylinders right now.
Thanks, Mark. So that's all the time that we have today. We'll do follow-ups for any questions that we weren't able to get to. Thank you all for joining. And as always, I hope you're staying safe and healthy. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.